No one likes being told what to do. This is something that I learned a long time ago doing youth ministry. When you were trying to get different people to volunteer to help out with things, you typically have a very hard time with it. The joke is that, people will sit here and, they'll say that, we support youth ministry, we support kids, we support missions. But then the second you turn around and say, okay, cool, well, can you show up on this night and maybe help us with this one individual task? All of a sudden people have every reason in the world for not helping out, for not serving. This is something that if you're a ministry leader, it almost becomes something you have to laugh at, because otherwise it'll just make you cry. But there's actually a spiritual lesson to learn here, because you see, doing things is not just a matter of being dedicated to your faith or somehow being dedicated to your church organization or something like that. There's actually a spiritual component to this. Now, I want to make certain that I caveat this appropriately. This is not a sermon about volunteering in your church. That certainly is one way that you can do the work God has intended for you, but the reality is that you have all kinds of skills and spiritual gifts that God has given you that enable you to be able to serve God's purposes. The real question is not, are you volunteering at church? It's, are you taking the opportunities that you have to be a part of God's plan? I hope that doesn't come across as just some, crazy, sappy salesmanship or something, because there really is truth to it. And you can actually see this in some of the lessons that Jesus Christ himself taught. In the parable of the talents, what we end up seeing is this metaphor of a master who gives a large sum of money, called a talent, to one servant, and then he gives still a large amount to another servant, but a little bit different than the first, and then to a third servant he gives the least amount. And what you see is the first two servants take the opportunity to do something with what they've been given. And as a result, the master ends up blessing them and ends up welcoming them. But the third ends up with all kinds of reasons and rationales for why he didn't do anything. And as a result, he just sat on it. He didn't lose the money, but he just sat on it. And the result is the master was angry with him and actually cast him out. When you look at this parable, there's a lot of allegory that's kind of taking place and a lot of context, but what you can take away from it in a nutshell is that these first two individuals had different amounts. They had different talents. By the way, that word is the same as what we know in English for a very explicit reason. These individuals had different amounts of talents, and so what they ended up with were different end results. However, the master was equally happy with them because they took advantage of the opportunity. The third looked at this as some task, and so he processed it in his head like a task. He tried to anticipate what he thought the master really wanted and then acted on his interpretation of what the master wanted instead of the opportunity that was presented to him. And as a result, he ended up falling short. When you look at your own spiritual life, you look at the different spiritual gifts, and you look at the different talents that you have, how are you using those things? Are you using those things as opportunities to be able to serve God? In some cases, that talent may be a particular skill that maybe you can use within a church. Maybe it's something that you can use within a community organization or a ministry. Maybe it's something that you can use within your social circle. Maybe your talent, the biggest talent that you have, is something as simple as parenthood, and that is an opportunity to do God's work, not just kind of the social expectations of what you should do to be a good mom or a good dad kind of work. There's all kinds of ways that we can do what God has intended for us. The question is not so much how much talent do you have, and it's not how big of an impact do you think you're going to make. It's, are you taking the opportunity to be a part of God's glory, or are you coming up with your own rationale for why you're doing less? Now, not to get too personal here, but one of the things I know frequently comes up, especially with a lot of people who are in a lot of the demographics that our church appeals to, is people will just bring up that, I'm just so busy. I just have so many things going on. I couldn't possibly do anything else. There was a reason why I started out saying that this was not a message about volunteering in church, because that work you may be called to may not be doing something in the church. Don't get me wrong. I would love it if you volunteer to do something, whether that's something with, a women's group or something with, a Bible study or kids activities or something like that. I would love it if you did that. But many of our spiritual gifts are maybe being called for different things. Like I said, maybe the biggest spiritual gift that you can use is your abilities you have as a parent to be able to instill a strong spiritual backbone in your household. Maybe it's something that you can do in your neighborhood with neighbors who are, particularly in need, or maybe don't have a relationship with Jesus Christ. Maybe that's the biggest thing you can do. There's all kinds of ways that you can serve. But so many of us will use that explanation of, I just have so much going on and I'm just so busy and, there's just no energy left at the end of the day. And we'll say all these things, and do we think these are new explanations? One of the things that we end up seeing Paul talk about in his second letter to the church in Thessaloniki is he talks about these individuals that he describes as idle. Now, when he describes these individuals as idle, I want to be very careful. Their definition of idle is very different from what we would say in our language. When he's talking about individuals who are idle, what he's really talking about are individuals who are idle from the perspective of the work that they could be doing for the body of Christ. You see, a lot of individuals would affiliate with the church because there were benefits. There was a sense of honor that you got from being a part of a group. A lot of people were able to get assistance with food or maybe money from the church. And so they would get these both emotional and physical benefits from being a part of the church, but yet they weren't doing anything in return. And when I say doing anything in return, they didn't have a youth ministry. They didn't have all of these other Bible studies per se like what we have. These were individuals that were simply caring for each other. They were identifying needs. They were meeting those needs. They were identifying different ways that they could serve one another and then going and doing it. So it was much more like supporting a family. I would bring this up to say something that maybe is a little bit personal or might even make some of you a little bit uncomfortable. I want you to think about the different things that you get from church, whether it's this church, whether it's another church. It could be anything. Most of you are meeting in a home that is not your own. You're getting these kinds of lessons. Maybe your children have been able to participate in different things. There's different things that you certainly have been able to benefit from. And so then I would ask you the follow-up question. What is it that you have done to be an active participant in the body of Christ? Whether that is for the formal organization, whether it's for the individuals that are a part of your church family, or whether it's maybe something in a different category. Because what we do know is we're all called to do something. It may be different. The amount, going back to the talents, that we come up with at the end of the day may be different, but we're all called to do something. What you're going to read about here in a second in 2 Thessalonians is about how Paul talks about these individuals and basically identifies that these individuals are, well, they're not being a part of the group. And if they're not being a part of the group, then they're really robbing themselves of a lot of the purpose that God has for them in their own life. And so if we read that lesson and we apply it to ourselves, then we would have to ask ourselves the same question. Are we allowing ourselves to be used in such a way that we are an active participant in this blessing of the body of Christ? Now, if you're super uncomfortable right now, or you might even be a little bit offended, then let me maybe offer this. When you read the next couple of verses that are right there in 2 Thessalonians, you can see the spirit with which Paul is offering this correction. It's not something that's there to punish. It's not something that's there to cause somebody to realize that they're a dirty, evil sinner per se. It's that there is a hope of redemption, of rejuvenation, of restoration of an individual. And this is something that we all need from time to time. This is something that me as a pastor, I need to remember it from time to time. Because if you want to know who has a really good opportunity to say, oh, I don't feel like doing that thing that, it's an opportunity I have, it's the guy who has a second job doing ministry. I'm tired. Maybe just am not in the mood one day to do something, but yet there is this opportunity. And you know what? I fail at that constantly. So it's something that applies to all of us. But the beauty in this is that our faith is not one of just fear and punishment. It's one of glory and redemption. And you can see that in what Paul's describing here. So the intent is not that you would just live in a state of shame or that you would just feel bad, but that you would realize that there is benefit here. And that benefit is the reason why we go into these lessons. What we see there in that parable of the talents was that there was immense blessing for the individuals that seize their opportunity to be a part of the work of God. And because of that, this is why we want to have these kind of conversations and why we want to go through these lessons. And I hope you understand that that is the heart in which that they are being given. I want for you the fullness of life that Christ has intended. And that comes through our obedience, yes, but it also comes from realizing that the things God has called us to do are not drudgery. It's not things that we do begrudgingly. They're things that we do because we have the opportunity to be a part of the glory of God's kingdom. And we do that in its most simplest form by leveraging the skills and the talents and the spiritual gifts that God has given us for purposes that are bigger than our own. That's our lesson that I have for you today. I hope you're able to get something out of it. Until we can meet again, God bless.